That night, rain poured down on Chicago like the sky was trying to wash everything away. Jenny sat outside the restaurant gate, her back pressed against the cold wall. Rainwater ran down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe it. She had no money in her pockets. She had no contacts left in her phone to call. 10 minutes ago, her own aunt, the only person she could still call family, had raised her hand and said, "Get out of my house. Don't ever come back." Jenny was 27 years old. She had spent 9 years in that house cooking, scrubbing floors, washing clothes, not a single day treated like family. 9 years, and all she carried out of that door were the clothes on her back. But that night, a black car pulled up at the gate. The man who stepped out was Sterling Kane, a name no one in Chicago dared to say out loud. He looked at her, said nothing, and simply opened the car door. And the life of Jenny Ross from that very second turned onto a path she could never have imagined. If Jenny's story touched your heart, hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. 9 years ago, Jenny Ross was 18 when she received a call from the hospital telling her that her parents had died in a car accident on the highway. She stood in the middle of an empty house, a phone in her hand, unable to cry because her body seemed to have frozen solid. 3 days after the funeral, Kathleen Ross, her mother's older sister, drove down from Chicago to take her. In front of the neighbors, Kathleen held Jenny and spoke with a voice full of pity, saying, "I'll take care of her like my own child. My sister can rest easy." But once the car pulled away from that street, Kathleen turned to look at Jenny and spoke in a completely different tone, saying, "If you live in my house, you work. Nobody feeds anyone for free in this world." Jenny nodded. She was 18. She had just lost her parents, and she had no one left in the world except this aunt. She thought doing housework to repay kindness was only natural. She didn't know that the word work, in Kathleen's mouth, carried an entirely different meaning. 9 years later, Jenny was 27. Every day she woke at 4 o'clock in the morning, when the whole house was still wrapped in darkness. She went downstairs to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for Kathleen and Tiffany, Kathleen's biological daughter. She ironed their clothes, polished their shoes, brewed coffee exactly to each person's taste. If Jenny woke even 5 minutes late, Tiffany would pound on her door and shout through it, "Do you think this is a hotel? Get up and do your work." Tiffany was 25 and had never poured herself a glass of water. Everything she needed was taken care of by Jenny. One evening, after Jenny finished cleaning the kitchen, she stood at Kathleen's bedroom door and knocked softly. Kathleen was sitting at the table counting money, not even looking up. Jenny took a breath and said, "Aunt, I want to ask you something. I want to go to school. I've looked into it. There are evening programs. I can still work during the day." Kathleen lifted her head and looked at Jenny as if she had just told a joke. "Go to school? Who's going to take care of the restaurant? Who's going to cook? Who's going to clean this house?" Kathleen set the stack of money down, her voice turning colder. "You should be grateful you have a place to live, that you have food to eat. There are plenty of people out there who don't have what you have. Don't start asking for more." Jenny stood still for a moment, then turned away. She didn't argue, not because she was afraid, but because she knew arguing wouldn't change anything. There was something Jenny never told anyone. Kathleen kept all of Jenny's identification documents locked inside a safe in her bedroom. Her identification card, her birth certificate, her social security card, everything was in there. Without those papers, Jenny couldn't enroll in any school. She couldn't apply for any other job. She couldn't open a bank account. She existed inside this house, but on paper, she almost didn't exist anywhere at all. That was why she endured for 9 years. Not because she was weak, but because she was trapped in a prison without visible bars. During the day, beyond the housework, Jenny was also sent by Kathleen to work at the restaurant as a kitchen helper. Kathleen owned a chain of mid-range restaurants in Chicago, and Jenny was unpaid labor. She washed dishes, chopped vegetables, scrubbed the kitchen floor from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, then returned home to cook dinner for the family. Not a single dollar in wages. Not a single day of rest. But every night, after Kathleen and Tiffany had gone to sleep, Jenny would quietly pull out from under her bed a stack of old books. They were law books she had found among things Kathleen had intended to throw away a few years earlier. Jenny read under the dim light of a small lamp in the cramped room beneath the stairs, writing down what she learned on the backs of old receipts. She didn't know if she would ever set foot in a law school, but she read. Every night she read. because it was the one thing Kathleen couldn't take away from her. One night, Jenny passed by the living room and heard Kathleen talking on the phone. Kathleen's voice was tense. "I don't care. You're the lawyer, you deal with it. Philip's illegitimate son is asking about the will. You have to make sure he doesn't find anything." Jenny stopped, pressing herself against the wall, holding her breath. Philip was the name of Kathleen's late husband, who had died 3 years earlier. Jenny didn't understand what that conversation meant, but she remembered it. She had learned one thing in 9 years of living in that house. Everything in that house had a secret, and every secret had a price. Jenny went back to her room and closed the door. She knelt beside her bed, clasped her hands, and closed her eyes. She didn't pray to be rescued. She prayed for only one thing, that she would have enough strength to endure one more day, because she believed that one day an opportunity would come, and when it came, she would be ready. That evening, Kathleen's restaurant received a very particular reservation call. A private room, dinner for 4, absolute confidentiality requested. No staff allowed to enter unless called. The restaurant manager kept nodding into the phone, his voice so deferential that everyone nearby understood this wasn't an ordinary guest. Jenny was in the kitchen, having just finished washing the last batch of dishes, drying her hands on her apron. She didn't care who was in the private room. Her job was to stay in the kitchen, finish her work, then go home and continue cleaning for Kathleen. But that night, things didn't unfold the way they always did. The server assigned to bring food into the private room pushed the door open, stepped inside, saw the man seated at the head of the table, and immediately his hands began to tremble. The glass of wine on his tray tilted, then slipped and shattered on the floor. He stammered an apology, set the tray down, then walked out, telling the manager he wouldn't go back in there, and asked to leave his shift entirely. The manager looked around and found no one else. Every server had found a way to avoid the private room after hearing who was inside. The manager hurried into the kitchen, saw Jenny stacking dishes on the rack, and said, "Jenny, go serve the private room for me. There's no one else." Jenny looked at him and didn't ask why. She removed her kitchen apron, put on a server's jacket, then picked up a broom and a cloth. Jenny pushed open the door to the private room and stepped inside. She saw shards of broken glass scattered across the floor, a dark red pool of wine spreading beneath the table. She didn't look up right away. She knelt down, gathered each piece of glass into her cloth, wiped the floor clean, then stood. Only then did she lift her gaze. 4 men sat around the table. 3 of them, seated along the sides, sat rigidly straight, their eyes cast downward. The man at the head of the table was entirely different. He wasn't looking down. He was looking straight at her. His face was sharply cut, his gaze cold, as if he had looked through thousands of people, and not one of them had ever made him look twice. A black suit, without a single crease. The entire room seemed heavier simply because of his presence. Jenny didn't know who he was. She didn't know the name Sterling Kane. She didn't know that in Chicago there were people who would change direction on the street just hearing that name. She only saw a man watching her, and she had work to do. Jenny took a clean cloth and wiped the table where the wine had spilled. She opened a new bottle, poured it into a glass, and set it down in front of Sterling. Her hand didn't shake. Not a single drop spilled. She placed the glass down, met his eyes for a brief second, then stepped back and waited to see if they needed anything else. Sterling didn't speak through any of it. He simply observed. He watched the way she knelt to pick up the glass without hesitation. Watched the way she cleaned the table without rushing, without fumbling. Watched the way she poured the wine, her hand steady as stone, and he watched the way she set the glass down and looked directly into his eyes. She didn't bow her head. She didn't avoid his gaze. She didn't tremble. In a room where even the men seated beside him didn't dare look up. This young woman in a server's uniform looked at him as though he were nothing more than an ordinary customer waiting for his meal. Sterling leaned forward slightly. "What's your name?" Jenny looked at him and answered simply, "Jenny?" Then she turned and walked toward the door to wait outside. She didn't linger. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't offer a polite smile. She didn't flatter him with a single word. She treated him exactly the way she treated anyone who walked into that restaurant, and that was what made it impossible for Sterling to look away. Dinner ended. The 4 men left the private room. 3 walked out first, Sterling last. As he passed by where Jenny stood waiting to go in and clear the table, he paused for a second. He didn't say anything. He only looked at her. Then he walked on. Jenny stepped into the room and began clearing the dishes. She didn't think anything more about that man. To her, it was just another shift like any other. She didn't know that later that night, in the car on the way home, Sterling Kane sat in silence the entire ride. The driver who had been with him for 12 years had never seen him like that. Sterling looked out the window, thinking about the young woman who had set a glass of wine before him without the slightest tremor in her hand. For the first time in a long while, someone had stood in front of him without fear. And that made him want to know more. 3 days later, Jenny was in the kitchen cutting vegetables when the manager came in and told her there was a customer seated in the main dining area, not in the private room, who had ordered a simple dish and specifically asked for Jenny to serve him. Jenny wiped her hands, put on a server's jacket, and stepped out. She recognized the man immediately. He was sitting at a table by the window, alone, without the 3 men who had accompanied him before. No private room, no request for secrecy. Just a man seated at an ordinary table in a crowded restaurant, composed as if he were nothing more than someone stopping in for dinner after work. Jenny walked up to the table and set the menu down. "Have you decided what you'd like?" Sterling didn't open the menu. He looked at her and said, "You choose for me." Jenny stood still for a second, then nodded, took the menu, and returned to the kitchen. She didn't ask what he preferred, didn't make a suggestion, didn't say another word. She placed a simple order with the kitchen, then brought it out. She set the plate on the table, poured water, placed the napkin to the right. Every movement was precise, professional, nothing extra, nothing missing. When she was finished, she stepped back and stood at a distance that allowed him to call if he needed anything, without being disturbed if he didn't. Sterling ate slowly. From time to time, he looked toward where Jenny was standing. She didn't look back. She stood straight, her eyes forward, her hands folded in front of her, the posture of a trained server. She didn't glance at him, didn't show curiosity, didn't try to start a conversation. In a restaurant where every other employee was whispering about the mysterious guest at the window table, Jenny was the only one who didn't care. When Sterling was nearly finished, he set his knife down and called her over. Jenny walked up. Sterling looked at her and asked, "How long have you worked here?" Jenny answered without hesitation, "Long enough." Sterling gave a slight nod, then continued, his voice even, without rise or fall. "You don't belong here." Jenny paused, her hand resting on a small plate she was about to clear. She looked straight into Sterling's eyes, set the plate back on the table, and said in a calm voice, each word clear, "You don't know anything about me." Then she picked up the plate and turned away. Sterling didn't call her back. He didn't show irritation, didn't smile, didn't react at all. He simply sat there, watching her as she walked toward the kitchen, her back straight, her steps steady, not once turning around. He had met hundreds of people, from the most powerful bosses to the most calculating politicians. All of them wanted something from him. All of them tried to impress him, or avoid him, or flatter him. This young woman did none of those things. She treated him as though he were just an ordinary man, and Sterling Kane couldn't remember the last time anyone had treated him like an ordinary man. Sterling stood, left money on the table, several times more than the bill. He put on his coat and walked toward the door. But before leaving, he turned back to the table, took a small piece of paper from his pocket, and placed it beneath an overturned plate. Then he walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Jenny came out to clear the table. She gathered the money, stacked the dishes, wiped the surface. When she lifted the inverted plate, the small piece of paper lay there. She picked it up. A string of handwritten numbers, the strokes strong and clear. No name, no message, just a number. Jenny stood there, looking at the piece of paper. Around her, the restaurant was still loud. Customers coming and going, staff moving back and forth. But she stood still for a few seconds, staring at the numbers in her hand. She didn't know why she didn't throw it away immediately. She had refused to talk to him. She had told him plainly that he didn't know anything about her. She should have crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash with the napkins and empty bottles. But she didn't. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. She didn't know why she kept it. Maybe it was because it had been a very long time since anyone had looked at her that way. Maybe it was because it had been a very long time since anyone had told her she didn't belong in this place. Whatever the reason, she kept that piece of paper. She didn't call, but she kept it. 2 weeks later, Kathleen called Jenny into the living room with a look of excitement Jenny had never seen before. Kathleen had just heard from a business partner that Sterling Kane, the only son of Conrad Kane, the head of the most powerful family in Chicago, was currently single. Kathleen didn't need to hear anything more. In her mind, a perfect picture had already formed. Tiffany would become Sterling Kane's wife, and the Ross family would step into true high society. Kathleen turned to Jenny, her voice sharp with command. "This Saturday night, you'll cook the most special meal you've ever made. The private room needs to be redecorated. Everything must be perfect. Do you understand?" Jenny nodded. She didn't know who this special guest was. She only knew she would once again cook while someone else took the credit, and serve while someone else enjoyed the result. On Saturday evening, Tiffany came down the staircase in an outfit she had spent the entire week choosing. She turned to Kathleen, smiling with absolute confidence. "Don't worry, Mom. He'll be mine. I've never failed." Kathleen nodded with satisfaction, then turned to Jenny, who was carrying a tray of dishes out of the kitchen. "You stay in the kitchen. Don't step outside unless I call you. And change into a clean apron. Don't let the guests see you looking messy." Jenny said nothing. She turned back into the kitchen and continued preparing the final dishes. Sterling arrived exactly on time. He stepped into the private room alone, without bringing anyone with him. Kathleen stood to greet him, her voice overly warm. "Welcome to our restaurant. This is my daughter, Tiffany. She's both beautiful and accomplished, graduated with top honors." Tiffany stood, extended her hand, her smile bright and practiced. "It's very nice to meet you. I've heard so much about you." Sterling shook her hand, gave a polite nod, then sat down. He didn't speak much. He answered Kathleen's questions with short, courteous replies, but he didn't open the door to any real conversation. Tiffany tried to impress him, talking about her travels, her refined tastes, her social connections. Sterling listened, nodded, and there was no light in his eyes. Dinner was served. Kathleen introduced it proudly. "My daughter prepared this dinner especially for you." Sterling took a bite, nodded. "It's good." Then he continued eating in silence. Tiffany glanced at her mother, a flicker of concern in her eyes, but Kathleen signaled for her to remain calm. The wine on the table ran low. Kathleen needed someone to pour more. She turned toward the private room door and called out loudly, "Jenny, come in here, bring the wine." Jenny was standing outside in the kitchen. She picked up the bottle, pushed open the private room door, and stepped inside. Then she froze. The man seated at the head of the table was the one who had left the small piece of paper with the phone number beneath the plate. The one who had told her she didn't belong in that place. The one she had looked straight in the face and told, "You don't know anything about me." Sterling Kane was sitting there, and he was looking directly at her. The coldness in his gaze shifted in a single instant. Not surprise, something sharper than that, as if he had just found a piece of a puzzle he had been searching for a very long time. Jenny panicked. She lowered her eyes, walked quickly to the table, set the wine down, and turned to leave at once. She didn't want Sterling to recognize her. She didn't want Kathleen to know she had spoken to this important guest before. She only wanted to disappear from that room as quickly as possible. But Sterling didn't let her go. He called after her, his voice calm. "Miss, would you pour me a glass?" Jenny stopped. She turned back, her hand trembling slightly for the first time since she had stepped into that restaurant. She picked up the bottle and poured wine into Sterling's glass. Kathleen watched the scene, her brow tightening. She saw Jenny pouring too slowly. She opened her mouth, her voice sharp. "Hurry up. Don't keep an important guest waiting. When you're done, get back to the kitchen." Jenny held the bottle. Her hand paused. She heard every word her aunt had just spoken, in front of strangers, in front of Sterling. For 9 years, she had heard words like that thousands of times. For 9 years, she had lowered her head, remained silent, and obeyed. But tonight, something inside her refused to bow any longer. Maybe it was because Sterling was watching her. Maybe it was because she had endured enough. Maybe it was because 9 years had finally reached their limit. Jenny set the bottle down on the table. She straightened her back, looked directly into Kathleen's eyes, and spoke in a calm voice so clear that everyone in the room could hear. "I'm your niece, not your servant." The private room fell into silence. Tiffany opened her mouth but couldn't say a word. Kathleen's face darkened, her hand tightening around the napkin on her lap, but in front of a guest, she couldn't do anything. Sterling looked at Jenny, then at Kathleen, then back at Jenny. He had seen enough. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket slowly, then said in an even voice, "Thank you for dinner. The food was very good. But I don't sit and eat in a place where people treat each other like this. Excuse me." Then he walked out of the private room without looking back. The door closed. Tiffany turned to Kathleen, her voice shaking with anger. "Mom, do you see now? It's her fault. Because of Jenny. He left. I told you, don't let her leave the kitchen." Kathleen didn't respond to Tiffany. She looked at Jenny, her eyes cold as ice. Jenny still stood there, her back straight, the wine bottle resting on the table. She knew what would come next wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in 9 years, she wasn't afraid. And that night was the night this story truly began. After Sterling left the private room, Kathleen remained seated at the table for 10 minutes in silence. Tiffany kept talking beside her, complaining, placing blame, but Kathleen didn't hear a word. She was staring at the door of the private room, where Jenny was still standing with the wine bottle in her hand. Then Kathleen rose. She walked toward Jenny, grabbed her arm, pulled her out of the private room, through the kitchen, out the back door, and dragged her straight into the car to go home. The entire ride back, Kathleen didn't say a single word. Tiffany sat in the back seat, arms crossed, her face flushed red. Jenny sat quietly, looking out the window. She knew the storm was coming. She just didn't know how fierce it would be. When they reached the house, Kathleen pushed the door open, pulled Jenny into the living room, and stood in front of her, eyes red with anger. Then she raised her hand. Jenny didn't move away. She stood straight, looking directly into her aunt's eyes. For 9 years, she had bowed her head enough. For 9 years, she had been silent enough. Tonight, she wouldn't bow anymore. Kathleen lowered her hand, her voice trembling with rage. "What did you do tonight? Do you have any idea what you just ruined? You ruined Tiffany's future. You ruined everything. Get out of my house, right now. Don't ever come back." Tiffany stood behind her mother, ran into Jenny's small room beneath the stairs, dragged all her clothes out into the hallway, and threw them onto the floor. "Ungrateful brat, get out. My mother fed you, gave you a place to live for 9 years, and this is how you repay her?" Jenny looked at the pile of clothes on the floor. There wasn't much. A few worn outfits, a pair of shoes with the heels worn down, a thin coat. 9 years in that house, and everything she owned fit into a small pile on the floor. Jenny bent down, picked up the coat, and put it on. Then she straightened, looked at Kathleen, and spoke in a voice so calm that even Tiffany fell silent. "I'll leave, not because you're forcing me out, but because I don't want to stay here another day." Kathleen didn't respond. She just stood there, watching Jenny walk through the front door, open it, and step outside. The door closed. For the first time in 9 years, Jenny stood on the other side of it. After Jenny left, Kathleen went down to the small room beneath the stairs, the room where Jenny had slept for 9 years. She searched through it, looking to see if the girl had hidden anything, and she found something. Under the bed, a stack of old books, pages dog-eared, filled with dense notes written in blue ink on the backs of old receipts. Law books. Kathleen looked at the stack, her face twisting with disdain. She gathered them all up, carried them outside, and threw them into the trash bin in front of the house. One by one they fell in, the pages Jenny had read for countless nights, the lines she had written with a hand worn tired after each day of labor, all of it lying among the garbage. Kathleen brushed her hands off, went back inside, and closed the door. Outside, the rain began to fall. Jenny walked along the dark street. She didn't know where to go. She had no money. Her phone held no contacts, except Kathleen's and the restaurant. She thought of the only place she knew how to reach. The restaurant. She walked 15 minutes in the rain, reached the back door of Kathleen's restaurant, and knocked. The night guard opened the door and looked out, seeing Jenny soaked through. Jenny said, "Could I stay inside for the night? I don't have anywhere to go." The guard looked at her, then shook his head, his voice uneasy. "Jenny, I can't. If Kathleen finds out I let you in, I'll lose my job. I'm sorry." Then he closed the door. Jenny stood outside the restaurant gate. The rain grew heavier. She sat down, her back against the cold wall, the same place she had been sitting at the beginning of this story. Rainwater ran down her face, but she didn't bother to wipe it away. She closed her eyes. 9 years. 9 years. And she walked away with nothing but the clothes on her back. No documents, no money, no family, not a single book. But she didn't know that someone was watching her. Sterling Kane had already ordered his men to keep an eye on Kathleen's restaurant weeks earlier, because the Kane organization was investigating a suspicion of money laundering through this chain of restaurants. His men had witnessed Jenny being dragged out earlier that night and had just reported that the girl was now sitting alone outside the restaurant in the rain. Sterling listened and said nothing more. He took his car keys and drove himself. 10 minutes later, a black car pulled up in front of the restaurant gate. Jenny heard the engine cut off. She opened her eyes. The car door opened. Sterling stepped out, standing in the rain, looking at her. He didn't say a word. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't ask what had happened. He simply opened the passenger side door and stood there waiting. Jenny looked at him. She looked at the open car door. The rain kept falling over both of them. Jenny hesitated for a second. Then she stood up and got into the car. Sterling closed the door for her, walked around to the driver's seat, got in, and drove away. No one spoke. There was only the sound of rain striking the windshield and the steady rhythm of the wipers moving back and forth. Jenny sat in the passenger seat, soaked, her eyes fixed straight ahead. She didn't know where this man was taking her. She didn't know who he truly was. But that night, in the middle of a Chicago rainstorm, for the first time in 9 years, someone opened a door for her, instead of closing one in her face. Sterling drove through the Chicago rain for 20 minutes, without saying a single word. Jenny sat in the passenger seat, soaked through, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She didn't ask where he was taking her. She was too tired to ask. 9 years of endurance, and tonight everything had come apart all at once. She simply sat there, watching the rain streak across the windshield, letting the car carry her wherever it would finally stop. The car pulled up in front of a building, in a quiet northern part of the city. Sterling turned off the engine, stepped out, and opened the door for Jenny. She got out and looked up at the building. Sterling didn't explain anything. He led her into the lobby, into the elevator, and up to an apartment on a high floor. He opened the door, turned on the lights, then stepped aside so she could walk in. Jenny crossed the threshold. The apartment was clean, fully furnished, carrying the scent of new wood and fresh fabric. She stood in the middle of the living room, looking around. A bed of her own, with crisp white sheets. A private bathroom with neatly folded towels on the rack, and a door with a lock, the key already set in place. For 9 years, she had slept in a room beneath the stairs without a lock, a place where Tiffany could pound on the door at any moment, where Kathleen could walk in without knocking. 9 years, and this was the first time she stood in a room she had the right to lock, a room no one could enter unless she allowed it. Sterling remained by the door, not stepping inside. He looked at Jenny and spoke briefly. "You stay here. No one will find you. This property belongs to my company, not to any individual. No one can trace it." Jenny turned to look at him. Her voice was hoarse from the rain and from exhaustion. "Why are you helping me? You don't know anything about me. You said so yourself." Sterling looked at her, silent for a second, then answered, "Because I want to." No further explanation. No reason given. 3 words. Then he gave a small nod, stepped out, and closed the door. Jenny heard his footsteps fade down the hallway, then the sound of the elevator doors closing. Jenny stood alone in the apartment. Silence. For the first time in 9 years, no one called her name to give her orders. No sound of Tiffany pounding on the door. No voice of Kathleen commanding her. Only silence. She walked into the bathroom. On the shelf was a set of clean clothes, neatly folded, exactly her size. Sterling had arranged it, perhaps the moment he received the call from his men saying Jenny had been thrown out. She took off her soaked clothes and stepped under the hot water. It ran over her skin, warm, clean, and she stood there for a long time, not wanting to step away. When she came out, dressed in clean clothes, and sat on the bed, she looked around the empty room. There was no more sound of rain. Outside the window, Chicago shimmered with lights. She sat there, her hands resting on her knees, her back straight, her eyes fixed on nothing. Then her shoulders began to shake. She couldn't hold it in anymore. Tears slipped down her face, silent, without a sound. She wasn't crying from pain. She had grown used to pain. 9 years, she had swallowed so many tears she thought she no longer knew how to cry. But tonight, she cried for something else. She cried from relief, because for the first time, She was sitting on a bed no one could force her to leave, because someone had opened a car door for her, instead of closing one in her face. Because the 3 words, "because I want to," spoken by a stranger that night, carried more weight than all the promises Kathleen had made over 9 years. The next morning, Jenny woke early, 4 o'clock. A habit built over 9 years wasn't easily broken. She stood in the kitchen, looking at a refrigerator that had already been stocked with food, then began to cook. She didn't know who she was cooking for. She only knew that every morning she cooked, and she didn't know how to live through a morning without cooking for someone. At 8 o'clock, there was a knock on the door. Sterling walked in, looked at the table already set, looked at Jenny standing in the kitchen, then sat down. He didn't ask why she had cooked. He ate, slowly, in silence. Jenny sat across from him, not eating, only watching him. In the middle of the meal, Sterling set his utensils down. He looked at the plate in front of him, silent for a long moment, then said in a voice lower than usual, "This tastes like the way my mother used to cook." Jenny didn't speak. She looked at him, and for the first time, she saw the coldness in Sterling's eyes soften. Not much, just a little, but enough for her to notice. Sterling didn't say much more. He only told her that his mother had died early, that she came from a family with nothing, and that when she married his father, the Kane family had never accepted her. She had lived her entire life in that house without ever being considered part of it. 3 sentences. He said only 3 sentences, then continued eating. But those 3 sentences were enough for Jenny to understand why he had stopped his car in the rain the night before. He didn't pity her. He saw his mother in her, a woman treated like an outsider in the very home that should have been her family. The 2 of them sat across from each other at the table. Morning light streamed through the window, falling across the wooden surface. No more words were spoken. But that morning, in the apartment Jenny had not yet learned to call home, an invisible thread quietly began to bind the 2 of them together. 1 week after that breakfast, Sterling came to the apartment in the afternoon. Jenny was sitting there, rereading the old notes she had written on the backs of receipts, the only notes that remained because she had slipped them into the pocket of her coat before leaving Kathleen's house. Sterling sat down across from her, looked at her, and spoke directly. "I don't give money to anyone for nothing. I helped you because I wanted to. But if you want to change your life, you have to take the step yourself. I'll arrange a position for you as a legal assistant at Kane Holdings. The salary will be standard market rate. Nothing more, nothing less. If you can do the job, you stay. If you can't, no one will keep you." Jenny looked at him and nodded. She didn't say thank you. She knew Sterling wasn't the kind of man who needed to hear gratitude. He needed to see action. But before Jenny could begin working, there was one problem that had to be solved. She had no identification documents. Everything was still locked in Kathleen's safe. Sterling called the legal department of Kane Holdings and said briefly, "Reissue all documents for this person, as fast as possible." For an organization with the influence of the Kane family, it didn't take long. 3 days later, Jenny sat in the legal department office and received documents bearing her name. Identification card, social security card, everything. She held the identification card in her hand, looking at her name printed clearly on it. Her hand trembled slightly. For 9 years, she had lived without any documents to prove she existed. 9 years, Kathleen had kept them locked away as a way to imprison her without visible bars. And now, for the first time in 9 years, she officially existed within the system. She was a person with a name, a number, and rights. She placed the card into her wallet, stood up, and went to her first day of work in her life. Jenny began at Kane Holdings that Monday. She was assigned to the legal department, an assistant position, her desk placed in the common area with the other staff. On the first day, she arrived earlier than anyone else. On the second day, the same. On the third day, the same. She was the first to turn on the lights each morning, and the last to turn them off each night. She didn't engage in small talk. She didn't tell anyone who she was, where she came from, or why she was sitting there. She simply worked, reading files, organizing documents, preparing summaries for the senior lawyers. Everything she did was precise, clean, not a comma out of place. At first, her colleagues looked at her with suspicion. A girl no one knew, appearing from nowhere, placed into the most important department of the company without any interview process. Everyone assumed she must have connections somewhere above. Everyone thought she wouldn't last long. Jenny knew what they were thinking. She didn't explain. She just kept working. After 3 weeks, Jenny was assigned to read and review a major real estate investment contract that Kane Holdings was preparing to sign with an external partner. This was routine assistant work, simply reading through and marking points of concern for the senior lawyer to review. But Jenny didn't just skim. She read every line, every clause, comparing it with the knowledge she had taught herself over 9 years from old law books beneath her bed. And she found something no one else had noticed. In Clause 14, Appendix C, there was a vaguely written sentence about the right to transfer assets. If the partner litigated under that clause, Kane Holdings could lose control of the entire asset involved in the deal. The company's senior lawyer, who had worked there for more than 10 years, had approved the contract without noticing it. Jenny wrote a short report, clearly pointing out the loophole, citing the exact clause, and proposing a revision. She sent it to the department manager. The report moved upward, and 2 days later, it was on Sterling Kane's desk. Sterling finished reading the report. He called the senior lawyer into his office. The lawyer walked in, confident as always, until Sterling placed Jenny's report on the table, turned it toward him, and said in an even voice, "Explain to me why a new assistant of 3 weeks sees something you missed in a contract worth millions of dollars." The lawyer read the report, his face gradually losing color. He had no answer. Sterling didn't need to hear more. He gave a slight nod, signaling for the lawyer to leave, then sat there alone, looking at the report with the name Jenny Ross printed in the top left corner. After that incident, everything in the legal department changed. No one said anything openly, but the way they treated Jenny shifted. In the mornings, colleagues began nodding to greet her when she walked in. During internal meetings, the manager began inviting her to sit at the table, instead of leaving her outside to take notes. When the senior lawyer needed someone to review an important contract, he began sending it to Jenny before sending it to anyone else. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew. This girl didn't need anyone backing her to prove her ability. She had proven it through her work. 3 months passed. One afternoon, Jenny received a message from Sterling's assistant, saying he wanted to see her in his private office at 5 o'clock. Jenny set her phone down and looked out the office window. She didn't know what Sterling wanted to say, but she stood up, smoothed her shirt, and walked out. Jenny walked into Sterling's office at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, exactly on time. Sterling was seated behind his desk, a white envelope lying in front of him. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply slid the envelope across the desk toward her and said, "Open it." Jenny sat down in the chair across from him and picked up the envelope. She opened it and pulled out a set of papers. The first line she saw was the name of the school, Columbia Law School. The second line was her name, Jenny Ross. The third line was the sentence she had dreamed of for 9 years, but had never dared to say out loud. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been admitted to the law program." Attached to the admission letter was a financial statement confirming that all tuition and living expenses had been covered by an educational fund under Kane Holdings. Jenny looked at the letter. She read her name over and over again. Jenny Ross. Her name, on a law school admission letter. She remembered the nights reading under a dim light in the small room beneath the stairs. She remembered the notes written on the backs of old receipts. She remembered the stack of books Kathleen had thrown into the trash in the rain that night. And now, her name lay on a letter from one of the best law schools in the United States. She didn't cry. 3 months earlier, in the apartment Sterling had given her, she had cried from relief. But now she didn't cry anymore. She had changed. 3 months at Kane Holdings had taught her that she possessed real ability, not something given to her by anyone, but something that had lived inside her for 9 years, waiting for its moment to emerge. Jenny stood straight, took a deep breath, folded the letter carefully, and placed it into the inner pocket of her coat, close to her chest. She lowered her head slightly toward Sterling and said, "Thank you." Just 2 words. Then she walked out of the office, her back straight, her steps steady. Sterling remained seated, looking at the office door that had just closed. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened, just slightly. The kind of softness only those closest to him would notice. 2 weeks later, Jenny prepared to leave for New York. She didn't have much to bring: a small suitcase, a few sets of clothes, and the stack of notes written on the backs of receipts that she had carried with her since the night she left Kathleen's house. The evening before her flight, Sterling came to the apartment. The two of them sat at the familiar dining table, the same place where 3 months earlier they had sat in silence after their first breakfast. Jenny looked at Sterling and asked the question she had held inside for 3 months. Aren't you asking for anything in return? You gave me a place to stay, a job, had my documents restored, and now you're paying for my education. I don't understand why." Sterling looked at her and remained silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice slow, each word clear. "I'll wait. When you're ready, you'll know." Jenny looked at him. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but she remembered it. She would remember those words for a very long time. The next morning, Jenny sat on a plane bound for New York. She looked out the window as Chicago grew smaller beneath her, the city that had held her captive for 9 years, then set her free in a single night of rain. She didn't know when she would return, but she knew that when she did, she wouldn't be the girl sitting curled up outside the restaurant gate anymore. Jenny began her life as a law student at Columbia. She attended classes during the day and worked evenings at the university library to cover her personal living expenses because she didn't want to owe Sterling another dollar. The schedule was heavy, the volume of material overwhelming, but Jenny didn't feel burdened. 9 years of waking at 4 in the morning and working until midnight had given her a resilience other students didn't have. When her classmates complained about the workload, Jenny simply lowered her head and kept reading. She had endured far heavier things than assignments. Each week, Jenny called Sterling once. The calls weren't long. Sterling wasn't someone who liked talking on the phone, and neither was Jenny. She spoke briefly about her studies, the library, the New York weather. Sterling listened, occasionally asking a short question. And every call ended with the same sentence from him: "As long as you're okay." No more questions, no demands. Just those 4 words, steady each week. A quiet way of letting her know that someone on the other end of the line was always there, ready to listen if she needed to speak. Jenny began to grow accustomed to her new life. For the first time, she was living for herself. For the first time, she was studying what she wanted to study. For the first time, she had a future to move toward, instead of simply surviving each day. But as Jenny's life was rising, back in Chicago, the lives of those who had once confined her were beginning to unravel in a way no one could have expected. While Jenny sat in a lecture hall at Columbia Law School in New York, in Chicago, Tiffany Ross's life was slipping steadily in a very different direction. After the night Sterling walked out of the dinner, Tiffany learned nothing from it. She continued living the way she had lived for 25 years, letting others take care of everything for her. Kathleen kept sending tuition payments every month, still believing her daughter was attending college regularly. But the truth was that Tiffany had dropped out more than a year earlier. She didn't go to class, didn't open a book, didn't take exams. Each month, the tuition money her mother sent, Tiffany used to buy designer goods, dine at restaurants, and live as if she were truly a high society young lady. Kathleen didn't know, or perhaps she didn't want to know. Kathleen's money wasn't enough to support the life Tiffany wanted, and that was when Raymond Voss appeared. Raymond was 58, a businessman, silver-haired, driving luxury cars, and very generous with young women. Tiffany met Raymond at a charity event she had slipped into, using an invitation she had managed to borrow from an acquaintance. Raymond liked Tiffany because she was young, beautiful, and knew how to make him feel important. Tiffany liked Raymond because he paid every bill without asking a single question. Each week, Raymond sent money, bought gifts, made restaurant reservations, and Tiffany called him her boyfriend, even though both of them knew what their relationship was built on. At the same time, Kathleen had her own secret. After Sterling rejected Tiffany and Jenny left, Kathleen felt lonelier than ever. The restaurant still ran, the money still came in, but every night, she sat alone in the large living room. Philip had been gone for 3 years, and Kathleen needed someone beside her. She began seeing a man she called someone special. She spoke with him on the phone every evening, her voice soft and warm, completely different from the cold, commanding tone Jenny had heard for 9 years. Kathleen kept this relationship hidden, not telling Tiffany. She wanted to wait for the right moment to introduce him, and that moment came on a Saturday afternoon. Kathleen called Tiffany home and told her to dress nicely, because she would be introducing her to the man she was seeing. "You'll like him. He's polite, wealthy, and very kind to me." Tiffany yawned, not particularly interested. She was busy texting Raymond to arrange a meeting for that evening. "Fine, Mom. If you want to introduce him, then do it." The two of them went to the restaurant. Kathleen had reserved a table in a quiet section toward the back. She sat down, adjusted her hair, and smiled as she waited. Tiffany sat across from her, scrolling through her phone. 5 minutes later, the restaurant door opened. Kathleen stood up, waving, her face lighting up. "He's here." Tiffany looked up from her phone, and she froze. The man walking toward their table, smiling, holding a bouquet of flowers, was Raymond Voss, the man who sent her money every week, the man she called her boyfriend, the man she had just texted to meet that evening. Raymond walked up to the table, saw Tiffany, and the smile on his face vanished. He stood there in the middle of the restaurant, looking at Kathleen, then at Tiffany, then back at Kathleen. His face turned pale. Tiffany spoke first. Her voice trembled with anger. "Mom, this man is mine. He's been seeing me." Kathleen looked at Tiffany, then at Raymond, her eyes widening. "What are you talking about? He's my boyfriend. We've been seeing each other for months." Tiffany shot to her feet, the chair scraping loudly across the floor. "Are you out of your mind?" "He's mine. He sends me money every week." Kathleen stood up as well, her voice rising. "Money? He sends me money too. Who do you think you are, stealing my man?" Tiffany shouted. "Stealing? You're the one stealing. I knew him first." Kathleen shouted back. "First or not doesn't matter. He chose me." Raymond stood between them, the bouquet in his hand drooping. The entire restaurant fell silent, watching. The two women he had been seeing at the same time turned out to be mother and daughter, now arguing in front of him in a crowded dining room. Raymond set the bouquet down on the table, stepped back twice, then turned and walked out of the restaurant without saying a word. He went straight out the door, got into his car, and drove away, leaving the two of them standing there, faces flushed, eyes burning with anger, under the gaze of everyone in the room. Tiffany dropped back into her chair, covering her face. Kathleen remained standing, gripping the back of the chair, breathing heavily. She didn't say another word. She picked up her handbag and walked out of the restaurant. That night, both of them called Raymond. Both apologized. Both said they would overlook what had happened. Kathleen called because she needed Raymond, needed his money, needed someone who made her feel she still had value. Tiffany called because she didn't know how to live any other way, except relying on a wealthy man. Neither of them let go, and neither of them realized that the man they were clinging to was the very one who would pull them both down to the bottom. While Kathleen and Tiffany were fighting over Raymond Voss in Chicago, Sterling Kane was facing a different problem. The Kane family wasn't the only powerful family in the American Midwest. There were other factions, other organizations, always looking for a weakness in Sterling to bring him down. And they had just found one. One morning, one of Sterling's most trusted men placed a large envelope on his desk. Inside were 4 surveillance photographs. Jenny walking across the Columbia campus. Jenny sitting in the library reading. Jenny stepping out of a dormitory building. Jenny standing at a corner cafe buying coffee. 4 photographs, 4 different angles, accompanied by a handwritten note. "We know who she is, and we know how important she is to you." Sterling looked at the photographs. He didn't get angry. He didn't slam the table, didn't shout, didn't curse. He simply sat there, looking at each photo in turn, then stacked them neatly and placed them back into the envelope. He picked up the phone and called 3 of his most trusted men into the room. When they stood before him, Sterling spoke in a calm voice, as if discussing the weather. "Find out who sent this. When it's done, report back." The 3 of them nodded and walked out. No one asked anything further. Within the Kane family, when Sterling said, "When it's done, report back," everyone understood what that meant. 2 days later, his men returned with a report. The faction that had sent the photographs issued a formal apology to Sterling. No one knew what had happened during those 2 days. No one asked, and no one ever spoke of it again. That night, Sterling sat alone in his office at Kane Holdings headquarters. The building had gone dark, only the light from his desk lamp casting shadows across the ceiling. Sterling opened the bottom right drawer, the one no one but him was allowed to touch. Inside was an old photograph, its edges yellowed with time. A young woman with dark hair and a gentle smile. His mother, the woman who had married his father with nothing, lived within the Kane family without ever being accepted, and died while Sterling was still too young to protect her. Sterling looked at the photograph, his fingers brushing lightly along its edge. He spoke softly, his voice meant only for himself. "I won't let anyone hurt her the way they hurt you." Outside the office door, his most trusted man stood guard. He heard those words, and he would never repeat them to anyone. The very next morning, Sterling called his people in New York and arranged for a security team to follow Jenny from a distance. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They followed her to school, to the library, to the cafe, always keeping enough distance that she wouldn't notice. Jenny lived the life of an ordinary student, unaware that behind her, someone was always there, keeping her safe. Until one day, Jenny sat in a class about influential business families in American history. The professor turned on the presentation and began introducing the case study for the day. Today we'll analyze the power structure and business model of the Kane family, one of the most influential families in the Midwest over the past 3 decades. The slide advanced, and on the screen appeared a large photograph. Sterling Kane. Jenny looked up at the screen. Her heart beat faster, but her expression didn't change. She sat straight, her eyes fixed on the slide, her hand gripping the pen beneath the desk until her knuckles turned white. The professor continued, explaining how the Kane family had built its business empire, speaking of the gray areas between legal and illegal, of the power the family held within Chicago's underworld. Jenny listened to every word. She listened, and she understood. The man who had opened a car door for her in the rain. The man who had given her a place to stay, a job, paid for her education. The man who told her each week, as long as you're okay. He wasn't an ordinary businessman. He was the head of one of the most powerful families in the United States. After class, Jenny returned to her room. She sat on the bed, holding her phone, looking at Sterling's name in her contacts. She hesitated for a long time. Then she called. Sterling picked up on the second ring. Jenny didn't greet him. She asked directly. The Kane family. My professor just spent 2 hours lecturing about your family today. Were you planning to tell me? Or were you going to let me figure it out myself? Sterling was silent for a second. Then he spoke, his voice unchanged. If you want to know, I'll tell you the truth. The Kane family is my family. I'm the one in charge. I never hid that from you, but I also never used that power to harm anyone who didn't deserve it. Jenny said nothing more. She hung up. For 3 days after that, Sterling received no calls from Jenny, no messages, not a single word. 3 days of complete silence. Sterling didn't call her. He didn't push. He waited. Because he knew Jenny needed time, and he respected that. On the 4th day, Sterling's phone vibrated. Jenny's name appeared on the screen. He answered. Jenny spoke, her voice calm and clear. I've spent 3 days thinking. I've read everything I could find about the Kane family. I know who you are now, and I'm calling to tell you one thing. Sterling remained silent, waiting. Jenny said, I don't care who you are. I care how you treat me. On the other end of the line, Sterling didn't respond right away. He was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said softly, as long as you're okay. And for the first time, Jenny smiled when she heard those words. From that call on, everything between them changed. No longer benefactor and beneficiary. No longer rescuer and rescued. From that moment, they were 2 people standing as equals, free, and choosing to trust each other. Everything began with a photograph. Tiffany was lying on the sofa, scrolling through her phone on a lazy afternoon much like every other afternoon, when she happened to see a post on the official social media page of Columbia Law School. The post honored the top students of the class, accompanied by a group photo taken in front of a lecture hall. Tiffany scrolled past the image, then her eyes paused on the front row. She zoomed in, and she recognized that face immediately. Jenny Ross, the girl her mother had thrown out of the house on a rainy night. The girl whose clothes she had once tossed onto the floor while calling her ungrateful, was now standing in the front row of a photo honoring top students at one of the best law schools in the United States. Tiffany took a screenshot and immediately sent it to Kathleen with a message. Mom, look at this. Jenny from our house is studying at Columbia Law. Kathleen looked at the photo, her expression slowly changing. She zoomed in, studied it carefully. It was Jenny, the niece she had forced to scrub floors, wash dishes, and work in the kitchen for 9 years. The niece she had believed would never step out from under her shadow, studying law at Columbia. Kathleen didn't feel pleased. Kathleen felt anger, because she understood that someone had helped Jenny, and she couldn't tolerate the idea that the niece she had looked down on was now rising higher than her own daughter. Kathleen acted that very night. She drafted a complaint and sent it to the disciplinary office of Columbia Law School. In the complaint, she wrote that Jenny Ross had embezzled money from the family to pay her tuition, that Jenny had stolen funds from Kathleen's personal account and fled to New York. She attached copies of transfer receipts, altered so that the recipient's name appeared as Jenny Ross. Every document was fabricated, but they looked real. Kathleen knew she couldn't accuse Jenny of using false identification, because that would expose the fact that she herself had illegally held Jenny's documents for 9 years. So she chose another path. She attacked the source of Jenny's finances. 2 weeks later, Jenny received an email from the school's disciplinary office. The school had received a complaint from a family member, accompanied by evidence suggesting that Jenny's tuition funding might be illegal. The school required her to suspend her studies until the investigation was complete. Jenny read the email, then read it again and again. She placed her phone on the table and looked out the window of her dorm room. Outside, New York was still loud, still moving, but Jenny's world had just stopped. 11 years. 9 years enduring in Kathleen's house, 2 years rebuilding her life here, and Kathleen could still reach all the way to New York to try to destroy everything. Jenny picked up her phone. She opened her contacts and looked at Sterling's name. Her finger hovered over the call button. She knew that if she called, Sterling would resolve everything. With the power of the Kane family, a university investigation would be nothing. But Jenny put the phone down. She didn't call, because she knew that if she relied on Sterling this time, she would rely on him again, and she would always remain someone who needed to be rescued. She didn't want to live like that. She had endured 9 years of dependence under Kathleen. She wouldn't depend on anyone again, not even Sterling. Jenny began to save herself. She contacted the civil registry office in her hometown to request a certified copy of her birth certificate. She called the legal department of Kane Holdings and requested official confirmation that her tuition was funded by the company's education foundation, fully legal, with proper invoices and contracts. She wrote a detailed statement, explaining that Kathleen Ross had illegally withheld all of her identification documents for 9 years, that she had never had access to any of Kathleen's accounts, that she had not received a single dollar from Kathleen since the day she left the house. She attached every piece of evidence, arranged in chronological order, presented clearly like a lawyer arguing before a court. Jenny stood before the school's disciplinary board. 4 people sat across from her. She presented her case in a calm voice, one piece of evidence at a time, one timeline at a time. She didn't tremble. She didn't ask for mercy. She simply told the truth and placed the evidence on the table. 20 minutes later, the disciplinary board announced that all accusations were dismissed. Jenny's funding was entirely legitimate. The complaint had no basis. Jenny walked out of the meeting room, down the school hallway, outside, and sat on a stone bench on campus. She looked up at the New York sky and took a long breath. Then she took out her phone and called Sterling. He answered on the first ring, as if he had already been holding the phone waiting. Jenny said, "Kathleen filed a complaint against me with the school. She accused me of embezzling family money. The school investigated and suspended me for 2 weeks. I gathered the evidence myself, presented it to the board, and they cleared all the accusations." She paused for a second, then continued, "I wanted you to know what happened, not so you could handle it, but because you're the person I want to tell." On the other end, Sterling was silent for a long time. Jenny thought the call had dropped. Then his voice came through, softer than usual, just enough for her to hear, "This is why I chose you." Jenny heard those words, and she understood. She understood that when he had said, "I'll wait," before she left Chicago, it hadn't been an empty promise. He had waited. He had waited for her to become the person she wanted to be, and today, she had proven that she didn't need anyone to save her. Jenny returned to class the following week. She studied as if she had never been allowed to study before. At the end of the year, when the graduation list was announced, the name Jenny Ross stood at the very top. Valedictorian of Columbia Law School. The girl with no documents, no money, no family. The girl who once read law books in secret under a staircase by dim light, now stood on the stage receiving her diploma with the highest honors of her class. And in the audience below, no one from her family was there. But it didn't matter. Because for the first time in her life, Jenny Ross didn't need anyone to validate her worth except herself. Jenny returned to Chicago on an autumn morning. She stood at O'Hare Airport, looking out at the city she had left more than 2 years earlier with a small suitcase and an acceptance letter tucked inside her coat. Now she came back with a valedictorian degree from Columbia Law School. But the first thing Jenny did upon returning to Chicago wasn't to call Sterling and ask him to arrange anything for her. She went out to find a job on her own. Sterling knew Jenny had returned. He knew she was looking for work. He could have made a single phone call and opened any door for her at any major law firm in the city. But he didn't. Because he understood Jenny. He understood that she would never accept success if it were handed to her instead of earned. So he waited, as he had always waited. Jenny applied to a small law firm on the south side of Chicago. It wasn't prestigious, wasn't located in a glass tower high above the city. It was simply a modest firm with 4 lawyers and a shared conference room. They hired her because her academic record was far beyond anything they usually saw. On her first day, Jenny sat at a small desk by the window, opened the file for her first assigned case, and began to read. The first case Jenny handled wasn't large by the standards of the legal profession, but to her, it was larger than any case could be. Her client was a 43-year-old woman whose husband's family had seized all her assets after his death. They claimed everything belonged to them, that the woman had no rights, that she should be grateful she had been allowed to stay in their home for so long. Jenny sat and listened to the client's story, and she saw herself in it. She saw 9 years in Kathleen's house. She saw the 4 o'clock mornings, the dinners cooked for others, the nights reading in secret under the bed with dim light. She saw a woman treated like an outsider in the very home that should have been hers. Jenny won that case. She found the flaws in the property transfer documents the husband's family had used, proving that the woman had a legal right to half the assets. The trial ended in a single afternoon. The client embraced Jenny outside the courthouse and cried. Jenny didn't cry. She simply nodded and said, "You deserve to have back what belongs to you." News of the victory spread faster than Jenny expected. A young lawyer, newly graduated, valedictorian of Columbia, winning her first case in such a decisive way at a small firm on the south side of Chicago. The legal community in the city began to speak the name Jenny Ross. And among those who read the news was a man named Drew Ross. Drew was 30 years old, the son of Philip Ross from a previous marriage, Kathleen's late husband. He had lived away from the family for years, but recently returned to Chicago with a single purpose: to reclaim the inheritance his father had left behind. Drew knew his father's will had been altered. Philip had substantial assets, and there was no reason he would leave his own son out of the will. Drew had hired a lawyer before, but the case hadn't moved forward. The previous lawyer wasn't skilled enough, or perhaps not brave enough, to stand against Kathleen. Drew came to the small law firm where Jenny worked. He sat across from her and told his story. His father, Philip Ross, had died 3 years earlier. The original will divided the estate between Drew and Kathleen. But after Philip's death, Kathleen produced a new will, one that left everything to her. Drew didn't believe it. He believed the will had been forged, but he didn't have enough evidence. Jenny listened, and she remembered a night, 9 years earlier. She had passed the living room and heard Kathleen speaking on the phone with a lawyer. "Philip's stepson is asking about the will. You have to make sure he doesn't find anything." At the time, Jenny hadn't understood. Now she did. Jenny took Drew's case. She began her investigation. And as she dug deeper into Kathleen's financial records, she uncovered something more. Kathleen had been using her chain of restaurants to launder money taken from the estate. The laundering operation Sterling had once been investigating when he sent his men to watch the restaurant now connected perfectly with Jenny's case. Every piece was falling into place. After her first victory, and taking on Drew Ross's case, Jenny made a decision. She would open her own law firm. She had the foundation. She had clients. She had proven her ability through her work, not through anyone else's name behind her. She named the firm Ross Legal Partners, placing her own last name, the name of her parents, on the sign. On the day the office opened, Jenny stood in front of the building, looking up at the sign bearing her name. Sterling stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, looking in the same direction. He didn't speak. No congratulations, no praise, no commentary. He simply stood there and gave a small nod, and Jenny understood. That nod carried more weight than any words anyone could have said. 1 week after Jenny opened her firm, Sterling called her and said, "Tonight I want to take you to meet someone. My father." Jenny was silent for a second. She knew who Conrad Kane was. She had read about him in a case study in law school. The former head of the Kane family. The man who had built the foundation for everything Sterling was running today. Meeting Conrad Kane wasn't a simple dinner. It was stepping into Sterling's world. Formally. Jenny said, "What time?" Sterling picked her up at 7 o'clock that evening. He drove her to a house in the western suburbs of Chicago, where Conrad lived in seclusion after retiring. The house wasn't as ostentatious as Jenny had imagined. There were no towering iron gates, no lines of security guards, just a large brick house at the end of a tree-lined road, its wooden gate already open. Sterling led Jenny inside. Conrad Kane was sitting at the dining table, alone, a glass of wine in front of him. Conrad was 63, his hair completely gray, his face heavy with deep lines, but his eyes were still sharp. He looked Jenny up and down in a single glance, then looked at Sterling, then back at Jenny. He didn't stand. He simply nodded, signaling them to sit. Dinner began. Conrad's private chef brought out the food. Conrad ate slowly, occasionally looking at Jenny. He didn't ask polite questions like what she did or where she was from. He went straight to the point. I hear you won your first case in a single afternoon, and now you're taking on the forged will case involving the Ross family. Do you think you'll win? Jenny set her knife down, looked straight into Conrad's eyes, and answered without hesitation. I don't think. I know I'll win. The evidence is clear. The previous lawyer just didn't know where to look. Conrad looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then he turned to Sterling and said in a rough voice, The girl's got nerve. I see why you chose her. Sterling didn't react. He simply continued eating, but Jenny noticed the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, so slight almost no one would see it. Dinner continued. Conrad asked Jenny about the case, about how she analyzed the evidence, about the legal strategy she was building. Jenny answered each question clearly, logically, without circling around. She didn't try to impress. She simply told the truth and spoke directly. At one point, she disagreed with Conrad on a legal point, and she said it plainly. Sir, that point isn't accurate. The law was amended 2 years ago. Conrad looked at her, then let out a rough laugh that echoed through the dining room. It was the first time in a long while Sterling had heard his father laugh. At the end of dinner, Conrad set down his glass and said to Jenny, I need a new legal advisor for the Kane family. The previous one retired. I want you to take the position. Jenny looked at Conrad, then at Sterling. Sterling didn't nod, didn't signal, didn't show any expression. He let Jenny decide. Jenny turned back to Conrad. I accept, but I work my way. I won't do anything illegal for anyone, including the Kane family. Conrad looked at her for 3 seconds straight. Then he nodded. That's exactly what I need. Jenny stood and excused herself. Sterling walked her to the door. As they stepped onto the porch, Conrad called Sterling back. Sterling turned. Conrad stood at the end of the hallway, looking at his son, then said in a low voice, That girl is the best thing you've brought home. Sterling looked at his father, silent for a moment, then said, I haven't changed. I just found a reason to control myself. Conrad said nothing more. He simply nodded once, then turned and walked back inside. Sterling drove Jenny away, but not home. He drove to the building on the north side of the city, the place where Jenny had lived during her first 3 months after being thrown out of Kathleen's house. The old apartment. Jenny recognized it the moment the car stopped. Why did you bring me here? Sterling didn't answer. He led her upstairs, opened the door. Inside, everything was exactly the same. The bed where she had sat and cried on her first night. The dining table where they had sat across from each other the next morning. The window overlooking the street where she had once stood, with tears running down her face in relief. Nothing had changed, as if the apartment had been waiting for her to return. Sterling walked to the dining table and placed a key on its surface. Not the old key Jenny had once been given, a new key. He looked at Jenny and said, The old key was me giving you a place to stay. This key is me giving you a home. Jenny looked at the key on the table. She looked at Sterling. The room was silent. There was no diamond ring, no kneeling, no long proposal. Just a key, a single sentence, and 2 people who had been through enough together that they didn't need anything more. Jenny picked up the key. She held it in her palm, feeling the cold metal slowly warm. Then she nodded, a single nod. No words, but both of them understood. That night, Jenny removed the chain she had worn around her neck for years, a chain without a pendant. She threaded the new key onto it and put it back on. The key rested against her chest, in the same place where she had once tucked her Columbia acceptance letter into her coat. The same place, but a completely different meaning. The letter had been the door to her future. The key was the door to her home. The day of the hearing arrived. The federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, 9 o'clock in the morning. Drew Ross sat on the plaintiff's side, his hand gripping the armrest tightly as he stared toward the courtroom doors. Across from him, Kathleen Ross sat at the defendant's table beside her private attorney, a salt-and-pepper-haired man with a confident demeanor, a thick file laid out in front of him. Tiffany sat in the row behind her mother, eyes moving across her phone screen, barely paying attention. Kathleen sat upright, her face calm. She had prepared carefully. She believed her lawyer was skilled enough to handle any attorney Drew might have hired. The courtroom doors opened. Jenny stepped inside. She wore a black suit, her hair tied neatly back, a briefcase in her hand. She walked straight to the plaintiff's table, placed the briefcase down, and took her seat beside Drew. Kathleen turned toward the sound of footsteps. She saw Jenny, and she froze. Kathleen's expression shifted from calm to shock, and from shock to horror. She opened her mouth, her voice trembling. "Jenny, you are the lawyer?" Tiffany looked up from her phone, glanced toward the plaintiff's table, then tugged at her mother's arm. "Mom, that is the kitchen girl from before. Why is she here?" Jenny didn't look toward Kathleen. She opened her briefcase, arranged her documents, and waited for the judge to begin the hearing. The trial started. Kathleen's lawyer stood first. He spoke at length about Kathleen's lawful inheritance rights, about the marital bond between her and Philip, about how the final will reflected the true wishes of the deceased. Then he turned toward Jenny, looking her up and down, his tone laced with mockery. "Your Honor, I would like to point out that the attorney representing the plaintiff is newly graduated. She hasn't been out of law school for long. I question whether she has the experience and capability to handle an inheritance case worth millions of dollars such as this." Jenny remained seated. She didn't grow angry. She didn't rise to challenge the remark. She waited. When it was her turn, she stood, buttoned her suit jacket, stepped forward before the judge, and opened her briefcase. She spoke in a calm voice. "Your Honor, I have two primary pieces of evidence." She presented the first, a fingerprint analysis report. The will Kathleen had submitted bore Philip's signature, but the fingerprints on the document didn't match the fingerprints recorded in Philip's medical records. The document had been signed by someone else, not the deceased. The courtroom fell silent. Kathleen's lawyer flipped through his files, searching for a rebuttal, but found none. Jenny continued. "The second piece of evidence, financial records showing that Kathleen had used her chain of restaurants to launder money from the misappropriated assets. The funds moved through multiple accounts, but all ultimately traced back to a single source. The inheritance left by Philip that Kathleen had claimed as her own. Jenny laid out each transaction, each figure, each account, precise, clear, not a word wasted. Kathleen's lawyer stood to object, but stopped midway. His eyes had flicked toward the last row of the courtroom. Sitting there, silent, was Sterling Kane. Black suit, expression unreadable, eyes fixed forward. He didn't speak. He didn't nod, didn't signal, didn't make a single gesture. He simply sat there. Yet his presence weighed more than any words could carry. Kathleen's lawyer recognized Sterling Kane, and his face drained of color. He sat back down, adjusted his tie, and murmured something to Kathleen that no one else could hear. Kathleen didn't listen. She shot to her feet in the middle of the courtroom, her voice rising. "You have no right to do this to me. I raised you. I fed you. I gave you a place to live. I gave you everything for 9 years. And this is how you repay me?" The entire courtroom turned toward Kathleen. The judge struck the gavel, calling for order. Jenny stood at the plaintiff's table, looking straight into Kathleen's eyes. She waited for Kathleen to finish. Waited for the gavel to fall silent. Waited until the courtroom was completely still. Then she spoke, her voice even, each word clear as if she were laying bricks one by one onto a table. "You didn't raise me. You imprisoned me." Silence. Absolute silence filled the courtroom. Kathleen stood there, her mouth open but no sound emerging. Tiffany sat behind her, her face pale. Kathleen's lawyer looked down at the table. The judge looked at Jenny, then at Kathleen, then wrote something down. In the days that followed, Kathleen had people send warning messages to Jenny, demanding that she withdraw from the case. Jenny received the messages but didn't respond. She continued her work. She didn't know that Sterling had already learned about those messages, and that he had handled them in his own way. Jenny never received another warning after that. She didn't ask Sterling what had happened, but she could feel that behind her, there was always someone standing there, silent, making sure she remained safe. The trial concluded after 2 days of proceedings. The judge delivered the verdict. Kathleen Ross was guilty of forging the will and laundering money. All misappropriated assets were returned to Drew Ross, the lawful heir. Drew stood, walked to the plaintiff's table, and shook Jenny's hand. His grip was tight, his voice choked. "Thank you. My father must be smiling from above." Jenny nodded, held his hand for a moment, then let go. She turned toward the last row of the courtroom. Sterling was still seated there, still without expression. But when their eyes met, he gave a slight nod, and for Jenny, that was enough. Kathleen and Tiffany were sent to prison. Beyond the charges of forging a will and laundering money, both of them were pulled into the investigation surrounding Raymond Voss, who had just been arrested for financial fraud, and the money the two of them had received from him over time was all illegal, adding another charge on top of their sentences. The prison doors closed behind them, and the life Kathleen had built on greed and control collapsed completely. Jenny continued working. After the trial, Ross legal partners took on many new cases. Jenny stayed busy from morning until night, meeting clients, reviewing files, going to court. She tried not to think about Kathleen. She tried to believe that chapter had ended, that she had moved past it, that everything was behind her. But some things don't end simply because we want them to. A few weeks after the trial, Jenny arrived at her office one morning and found a small package on her desk. A brown paper box, no larger than the span of her hand, with no sender's name, only her name and the office address. Jenny looked at the box, unsure who had sent it. She opened the lid. Inside, resting on a layer of white tissue paper, was a bracelet. Jenny stared at it, and the world around her stopped. She recognized it immediately, a thin silver bracelet, its small floral engraving worn by time. The bracelet her mother had worn every day, the one Jenny had seen on her mother's wrist every morning as she prepared breakfast, every evening as she sat reading beside Jenny's bed. The bracelet Jenny had searched for among her mother's belongings after the funeral but had never found. She had thought it was gone. She had believed it had been buried with her mother, or lost somewhere in the chaos after the accident. For 9 years she had believed it had vanished forever. Jenny turned the box over. On the bottom, a small piece of paper was taped, the handwriting shaky, but unmistakably Kathleen's. "I kept this all these years. I don't deserve to keep it anymore." Jenny sank into her chair. She held the bracelet in her palm, her fingers tracing the faded engraving. Kathleen had taken the bracelet from her own sister after she died. She had kept it for 9 years, hidden somewhere in the house where Jenny had lived without ever knowing. 9 years Jenny had been there, in the same house, scrubbing floors, cooking meals, washing clothes, while her mother's bracelet sat only steps away. And she had never known. Kathleen had never told her, had never given it to her. She had kept it as if it belonged to her, even though it never had. And now, from inside a prison cell, Kathleen had sent it back. No long apology, no explanation, just one sentence. "I don't deserve to keep it anymore." Jenny sat alone in her office. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass, falling across her desk, across the silver bracelet in her hand. Outside, Chicago moved as it always did. Employees passed through the hallway, phones rang, footsteps echoed. But Jenny heard none of it. She sat there, holding the bracelet, looking at it, and the tears began to fall. She cried without a sound. No sobs, no shaking shoulders, just tears slipping quietly down her face, falling onto the desk. She didn't cry out of anger, not because Kathleen had kept the bracelet for 9 years without a word, not because of the 9 years she had been treated like a servant. She cried for something simpler and more painful than all of that. She realized that she still loved her aunt. After everything Kathleen had done, after 9 years, after the accusation at the school, after the trial, after all of it, Jenny Ross still loved her. Because Kathleen was her mother's sister, because no matter how Kathleen had treated her, the same blood that ran through her mother still ran through Kathleen. And Jenny could not bring herself to hate someone who carried her mother's blood. Jenny slipped the bracelet onto her left wrist. It was slightly loose, turning gently as she moved. She sat quietly for a few more minutes, wiped her eyes, took a deep breath. Then she stood, picked up her phone, and called the prison. She requested to register for a visit with Kathleen Ross. No one had asked her to go. No one had required it. Sterling had not suggested it. Drew had not mentioned it. This was her decision alone. Jenny stepped out of the office, the silver bracelet on her wrist, the key resting against her chest on its chain. She knew she needed to go, not to hear Kathleen apologize, not to forgive her because she deserved forgiveness, but because Jenny needed to close this chapter. For herself. Jenny arrived at the prison on a Tuesday morning. She registered for visitation, then sat in the waiting room, looking at the gray walls and the worn plastic chairs. Around her were people visiting loved ones, some crying, some sitting in silence, some holding hands through glass partitions. Jenny sat alone, her right hand gently turning the thin silver bracelet on her left wrist. She didn't know what she would say when she saw Kathleen. She only knew that she needed to be here. The visitation room door opened. Kathleen walked in, Tiffany following behind her. Jenny looked at her aunt and almost didn't recognize her. Kathleen had lost a great deal of weight since the last time Jenny had seen her in the courtroom. Her hair had turned almost completely gray, her face hollow, her eyes sunken deep. She was no longer the proud woman who once sat in elegant restaurants giving orders to everyone around her. She walked slowly, her back slightly bent, gripping the edge of the table as she sat down. Tiffany sat beside her mother, her eyes lowered, saying nothing. She had changed too. The arrogance was gone, the sharp edge gone. What remained was a woman in her late 20s in a prison uniform, shoulders drawn inward, quiet. Kathleen looked at Jenny. Her eyes fell on the silver bracelet on Jenny's wrist. Her voice came out hoarse. "You got it." Jenny nodded. The two of them looked at each other across the table. 9 years. The trial. The notes written on the backs of receipts. The pile of books thrown into the trash. The rainy night outside the restaurant gate. Everything sat between them in that silence. Jenny spoke first. Her voice was calm. Neither cold nor warm, just clear. "I didn't come here to hear you apologize. I came to tell myself that chapter is over." Kathleen heard that, and her eyes reddened. She didn't cry immediately. She swallowed, looked down at the table, then back up. Her voice trembled, each word heavy. "I had a chance to be real family to you. My sister entrusted you to me before she died, and I had 9 years to do the right thing. But I chose wrong. I chose money, chose control, chose to make you serve instead of loving you. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that." Tiffany sat beside her mother, silent since they entered. But when Kathleen finished speaking, Tiffany looked up. She looked at Jenny, her eyes red, her voice so soft Jenny had to lean forward to hear. "I've hated you for years. Every time Mom made you do something, I was happy because I thought you deserved it. Every time you were yelled at, I felt like I was better than you. But sitting here now, I understand." She paused, swallowing hard, then continued. "I hated you because you had something I never did. Not money, not sterling. It was that you knew what you wanted. You knew you wanted to study law even when you were reading under the bed in secret. Me? I'm nearly 30, and I've never known what kind of life I wanted. I only know how to depend on others. On my mother, on Raymond, on anyone with money. And now I'm sitting here, with no one left to depend on." Jenny looked at Tiffany. She said nothing for a few seconds. Then she nodded, a small nod. Not forgiveness, not pity, just acknowledgement. Acknowledging that for the first time in her life, Tiffany had spoken something true. Jenny turned back to Kathleen. She said, "I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to carry that hatred into my new life." Kathleen lowered her head, tears falling onto the table. She couldn't say anything more. Jenny stood up, pushed her chair back in. She turned and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, she paused, turned back to Tiffany, and said, "It's never too late." Then she walked out of the visitation room, the door closing behind her. A few days later, Tiffany received a small package from outside. Inside was an old book, the cover worn, the pages yellowed, corners folded in many places. The first law book Jenny had ever read in secret under the bed, in the small room beneath the stairs in Kathleen's house. The same book Kathleen had thrown into the trash the night she drove Jenny out. Somehow, Jenny had found it again, and now she had sent it to Tiffany. Inside the front cover, written in blue ink, was a single line, "It's never too late." Tiffany held the book, looked at those words, and for the first time in her life, she opened the first page and began to read. That evening, Jenny sat at the dining table in the old apartment with Sterling. She told him about the prison visit, About Kathleen, about Tiffany, about the book. Then she added something more. I called the prison and arranged to cover medical expenses for Kathleen and Tiffany. They both need treatment. Sterling looked at her, silent for a moment, then asked, "Why? After everything they've done to you?" Jenny looked down at the silver bracelet on her wrist, turning it slightly, then said, "Because my mother would want me to. She's still my mother's sister." Sterling looked at Jenny. He didn't say anything else. He didn't comment, didn't praise, didn't object. He just looked at her, and in those eyes that were always so cold, something softened, quietly, deeply. He understood. This was why he loved this woman. Not because she was intelligent, not because she was strong, but because after everything life had done to her, she had still managed to keep her heart intact. 6 months after the trial, Jenny stood in front of a small classroom in a community building on the south side of Chicago. It was a free legal class, one she had opened herself, for women who had been stripped of their rights, deceived in property disputes, treated unfairly without ever knowing what rights they had. Each week, Jenny stood before the class, teaching about the law, about rights, about how to protect themselves through the law instead of through tears. The women sitting in front of her watched, listened, took notes. They didn't know that the woman standing before them had once been one of them. Outside the glass door of the classroom, Sterling leaned against the wall, a cup of coffee in his hand, watching inside. He watched Jenny as she spoke, as she raised her hand to explain a legal clause, as she smiled when a student asked a question. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, the kind of smile very few people in this world had ever seen on the face of Sterling Kane. Conrad stood beside his son, leaning on his cane, looking through the glass. He watched Jenny, then turned to Sterling, his voice rough. "That girl is the best thing you've ever brought home." Sterling didn't turn. He kept looking at Jenny through the glass and gave a slight nod. Nothing more needed to be said. Inside the classroom, Jenny paused in the middle of her lesson. She looked down at her stomach, now gently rounded beneath her shirt. She smiled, resting her hand lightly on it for a moment, then lifted her gaze back to the class. The women sitting in front of her, each with their own story, each carrying their own wounds. Jenny looked at them, and she spoke the final sentence of that day's lesson. The law doesn't exist to protect the strong. It exists so the weak don't have to beg anyone to save them. That afternoon, Jenny gazed out by the window of the Ross Legal Partners office, looking down at Chicago. The city stretched out below her. Tall buildings, long roads, streams of cars flowing endlessly. She stood there, the silver bracelet on her right wrist, the necklace at her chest catching the light with the key Sterling had once placed on the table in that old apartment. Behind her was the office bearing her name. In front of her was the city that had swallowed her 9 years ago, and now lay beneath her. Jenny Ross, now in her early 30s, once sat outside a restaurant gate in the rain, without a single dollar in her pocket. Now stood here, looking out over Chicago, and smiled. Thank you for listening to the story of Jenny Ross. If this story touched your heart, please press like to support us and share this video with those you believe need to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you don't miss new stories each day. We'd truly like to know how you feel after hearing this story. Please leave a comment sharing what you feel deep in your heart. We will read every line and cherish each one. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.